Having the right access controls to access your data present in data lake is very critical. It is important that you have the right levels of access control based on the personas who are going to access the data. Welcome friends to today's topic. We are going to discuss about the various access controls that you can implement for accessing the data in your data lake. And we will specifically talk about some of the services using AWS as an example. But the same strategy and the same key considerations can be applied across various ecosystems. It can be any of the cloud providers, or maybe even if you're working on an on-prem system. The target audience for this session is again the data architects or the solution designers or the tech leads who are going to design and think about the various strategies to access the data. Let's get started, and I'll try to give some examples before we dive deep into this. Let's say there is a bank. Let's call it as the Earth Bank. Okay, and like any other bank, there are customers for this bank. Okay, let's say this guy is Tony Stark, and he has a lot of $1 million with him. He's one of the prime customers of this bank. The other personas would include the bank manager. Let's say Martha is the bank manager, and Linda is the employee of the bank. There's also chief of security. Let's say his name is Rob, and these four have access to this bank since they are all related to this bank, and they have been visiting this bank. They have access now, but the access that they have, even though they have the access to the bank, right, to the main gates of the bank, they may not have access to each and every room within the bank. Okay, so let's try to understand what kind of access levels they would have. Okay, there's a locker room where the customers can have their money or any other valuables. So who would have access to this room? Okay, we'll think about it. Then there is this manager room, okay, where the manager can sit and do his or her work. Okay, and then we have a common meeting room, right? Let's say so these three rooms are there present in this Earth Bank, and we are going to talk about mainly about the access required for these. Okay, now it's not that all of them would have access to all of these places within the bank, right? So who would have access to this locker room? So a guy, Tony Stark, he would have this access to this locker room because he has some valuables here. Now within this locker room also there would be small lockers, and he would only have access to this. Plus the bank manager, right? Because generally for lockers, right, there are a couple of keys. One key would be with the customer, one key would be with the manager, right? And there are different types of security mechanisms. So let's say only these two would have access to this room. Now the main security chief, right, he would not have access to this locker room. Maybe he just have access to the outside but not the inside. Employees, right, employees won't have access to this room, right? So there are only designated access provided. Similarly for the manager's room, right, there would be access only for Martha. No one else can access it. Now see, if required, right, if she wants to call someone to have a discussion, then maybe she can give that access, right? That is a temporary access. Now remember all these things. Okay, she can give a temporary access to someone. Okay, if a customer has come in, she can give the access to that customer or let's say she is going to hire some PA for a 1 or 2 weeks. She can give access for that couple of weeks to that person. And the meeting room, finally, again the meeting room access would be there for the bank manager and the employees, all the employees. Here also there won't be access to the customers, okay, or any other parties who are related to the banks. So if you see, right, in the actual system, in real life world also, when we give access, it's not that each and everyone would have the same levels of access, right? It all depends on what kind of role they are playing. Okay, based on the roles, this access are given. So similar thing happens when we are storing the data. Okay, as a data architect or as a person, right, who is designing the system, giving the access, will keep all these things in mind while giving the access. Now let's try to um, use all these real life examples while giving the access to our data. Let's try to look at how do we give access to the data, what can be the strategies, what can be the key considerations while giving this data and the access to this data. This is a storage layer. These are the S3 buckets where you have the data lake, and we generally categorize our buckets as a raw bucket or a clean bucket, or layers. I would say raw layer, clean layer, transform layer. Some people would call it as, so those who have come from the Databricks background, they'll call it as a bronze, silver, and gold layer, right? These terms are different. Some people may call raw as a landing layer as also, or there would be a different landing layer altogether. But Indian at a very high level, trying to understand that these are the high level categories of your storage system. Okay. Now, how do you access these buckets, right? Now you want to access these buckets. Now there are various ways. You can directly access these buckets, or you can give access through Athena, right? Those who have been working on AWS, they would understand what I'm trying to say here. To explain it to the other folks who are not from AWS background, Athena is a interactive querying service. You can query the data which is present in your S3 system using Athena. You can create tables, you can give structure to these buckets, and you can query it. And this whole access thing can be controlled through a service called AWS Lake Formation. So which table to be accessed, right? Those kind of permissions can be given through a service called AWS Lake Formation. So this layer becomes your access layer, right? How do you access the bucket and through which service? Now comes our various personas who are going to access this data. Okay, in a data ecosystem, let's talk about some of the key personas, right? Who is going to access? The very first one are the data engineers, right? Who are building this ecosystem, right? These are the main guys who are creating the systems. Then there are data scientists who are going to use this data for their exploratory purposes. They want to play around with this data, they want to build some models, right? So these are the two important personas who have a very much granular level access to this data, or who should have access to this data. Then there are other personas, right? Like a data analyst who is going to analyze the data, right? If there is some query, she is going to analyze it, or just like based on some business requirement, this person would analyze the data. There would be support staff who is managing all this ecosystem. They may just have a read-only access to the high-level pipelines, maybe not to the exact data. And finally, there would be management folks who wants to, see some of the reports or the dashboards, right? So they also want to have the access to this data. So what kind of access levels we should be giving, right? Should we give them access to everything? Should everyone have the same access? No, right? We just saw it in the real world example. How does the bank manager or the employee or the customers, the security chief, there would be many other, people involved with the bank who would have different levels of access. So same thing happens here, right? So all these user personas should not have the same levels of access. So what we can do, right? So the access to your buckets, right? You can give access only to the data engineer or the data scientist, because they need to have access to this data, right? They need to play around with the data. Now, even it may happen that, raw layer access, you can go to the data engineer. The data scientist can have the raw layer access. It may happen the transform data, maybe the data scientists don't really need that. They just need the raw layer data. So again, within this also we can, think about it. But the main thing is they would need access to the data which is present in the buckets. But do you think the data analyst would need an access to the bucket, right? The actual data. They may not need that, right? They don't want to play around with the actual data. So what we can do is give them access to only the querying access through Athena. So they don't really need an access to these buckets, right? Even support staff or managers, they are all interested in querying the data through the service like Athena, right? So for these kind of personas, right, we give them access to Athena. Don't give them a direct access to the bucket. They don't want to read or write directly in the bucket. So see, we need to work on the, again, some of the AWS principles which are related to IAM, least least privilege access. It's very similar to this. You only give access to those personas the kind of access they really need, right? In a previous example, there is this meeting room access, right? You don't want to give the meeting room access to your customers, right? It is meant for the employees. Only if there is some discussion that you have planned, that time you can give a temporary access. So it may happen, right? Temporary, sometimes the data analyst may ask for a access on the bucket. That time we can think of providing it. But in a normal scenario, you don't really need to give that kind of access. Okay, so may it be data analyst, support staff, or manager, you give them access to Athena. And the access control can be done through AWS Lake Formation, which we'll see in the next slide. We can go one step further, right? Using Lake Formation, if there are multiple tables, right? You don't want to give the access of each and every table to data analyst and the manager, or within a table also, if there are 10 columns, it's not always required that all the 10 columns access should be given to data analyst as well as manager, and we'll have a look at it as well. So this slide mainly talks about like who should be given the access to the data in the buckets and who should be given access through the interactive querying service, right? Don't give these people the access to the data, right? See, this raw layer, this storage layer, right? This is the most important one. There could be sensitive data also. There would be a lot of data related to the system which you don't really want to expose it to everyone. Only give it to those who are really need it. Again, to explain this, right, let me give another example. Let's say Tony Stark, right? He wants to access his cache. Okay, so cache is this raw layer. Okay, let's talk about the storage layer where the cache is there. But when he wants to move the cache from this account to a third party, he wants to pay some of his bills, right? What he would do, is he going to go and physically take this cache out? No, right? So he does not need a direct access to this cache. He would access it through the portal, right? He would log into the bank portal and then he would access. It is very similar to this, right? So a data analyst, right, they don't really need access to this data. They can access it through Athena. It's a very similar thing. But at the same time, in the bank also, there would be some employees who may need access to the cache. They may want to do some physical transfer. It may happen sometimes, right? So that times you can think of them as the data engineers who are handling the data at its most raw format in the storage layer. Okay, so remember from this slide, right, to summarize, when you give the access, look at the personas. Based on the persona, you give the access. If you really need access to the raw data which is present in your object store, only then give it to those personas. For others, think about giving it to some of the querying service. Now it can be Athena if they are accessing it through Presto, to any other querying service, right? If they are accessing through Redshift, Snowflake, it can be anything. Okay, so don't really give an access to the underlying direct buckets, and it can be done, right? Lake Formation now has that kind of abstraction where you can just get to the access to the higher level querying engine and not to the buckets. Okay, moving on, right? Now let's talk about a very first analogy that we saw, right? A particular persona, the bank manager, may have an access to his own cabin, right? While all employees may not have. Okay, let's try to see how it can be implemented in the data world. So we have this, various user personas, data analyst, support staff, and manager. And what we saw in the previous slide, will not give them access to S3 bucket directly, but it will be through, these querying service and all. Now, it may happen, right? Let's say there is a particular table which holds the customer details, okay? And there are various customer details in there. Like the customer names and the mobile numbers as well, which is a sensitive data. Now, it may happen that the data analyst need access to this table and to all the columns, even the mobile numbers, because based on the mobile number, she wants to do some, filtering kind of a thing. It can happen. That would be a need-based requirement, right? So how this can be managed? So through Lake Formation, using a service like AWS Lake Formation, we can give access to a particular column as well, and we can deny the access for a particular column as well, right? So what you will have to do, you will have to bring this table in the control of AWS Lake Formation, right? And then manage the access. So within the AWS Lake Formation, you provide access to this particular role or the user, and you can say, okay, for this customer table and all the columns, I would provide an access to this. Now this can be done through AWS Lake Formation. This lecture is more about a high level, data strategy discussion. Will not go into a deep dive into lake formation, but yeah, if any of you are interested in that, maybe let me know in comment, and we can think about having a separate lecture on that, maybe in future. As of now, I'm not covering any of these services in details, but yeah, if that is what people are looking for, we can do that sometime. Coming back to this example, now let's say this manager, right? Manager also wants an access to this table, but then he does not really need access to this mobile number, right? He does not need access to this attribute because it's sensitive data, and he is only interested in understanding how many customers are there, where do they stay, their region, and there would be other attributes also, right? So that can be done, right? It can be done. So how can that be done? Let's say when the manager tries to access it, right? What he will see, he will not see the data in this mobile number column. So in lake formation, we'll go and we'll not give an access to this person, okay, to this persona. We will say, okay, hide this column. So what will happen when the manager tries to seize that? He will not see this column at all, okay. If you're doing it through lake formation, he will not see the column at all. Now there are various ways to abstract this column. You can either hide this column like in lake formation, or you can do something like a masking, right? This example is like a masking. You can make this as null. If you're using AWS, you can write a custom code to do masking. There are various integration. I think if you're using something like Redshift, there is an integration with Protegrity which you can do. Snowflake provides a dynamic data masking. Azure provides dynamic data masking. So those features you can use. You can as a data architect, you can explore what all tools you are using, which cloud provider you are working on, and based on the overall tools that the organization have accepted, you can think about any of these tools. Or the third option is, which is also user logic, is tokenization. Okay, this icon is for tokenization. So you can tokenize the data. So you can replace the mobile numbers with some other tokens, which can be replicated, can be de-tokenized again later. So there are various strategies of this. Again, it's a very vast topic about tokenization, encryption, decryption, or masking of data, which we will cover in one of our lectures. But for time being, try to understand this. It is all based on personas. So if it's a data analyst queries the same table, that person, that persona, that role, or that user would be able to see all the columns. But at the same time, if there is any other persona, they may not be able to see some of the sensitive columns. And this can be controlled based on what we really want to show or not. So it may happen, right? Sometimes you want to give some temporary access. You can think about that also. There are provisions for having temporary tokens, temporary access, or you can do it manually and then remove it. There are various ways to do that. We are not going into a lot of details how to implement all these things. It's more about, this slide is more about having the strategy. So remember this. The previous slide was more about giving the access to the underlying buckets or not. This slide is more about if the roles have access to the buckets through Athena, then how do you restrict a particular persona to a particular table, particular database, or a particular column? And nowadays, I think Lake Formation also has a feature for having a cell level filtering, where you can also control the cell level data. I have not tried that, but you can explore it. So yeah, that's it, what I wanted to cover in this today's lecture. It was all about the data access control and the various ways to do that. You can do a deep dive around this. I also have a Medium article which I'll try to put that into description or one of the comments. Yeah, if you have liked my content, you can follow me on Medium and Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. Yeah, finally, the photos that I've used, these are from Unsplash, from all these creators. So thanks for that. And all the cool icons are from Iconsit. Hope you have enjoyed this, and do let me know if you are looking for any other session on any of specific topic. I would be more than happy to cover that. Thank you everyone, and have a good day ahead. Bye bye.